Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be doing my 14.11 mid-lane tier list. So if you enjoy content, subscribe and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. We saw direct nerfs towards both Hui and Aurelia. Talia received nerfs kind of directed towards both jungle and mid. She was overperforming in elite play, so they brought her down a bit. We saw buffs towards Pantheon, and then we've seen the rise of another champion, Tryndamere, who is really proven to be the best mid laner in the game at the moment. He is being nerfed in 14.12, but let's cover the changes. So to begin with, Corki and Azir still make up the D tier. Both these champions still underperform pretty heavily within the mid lane. Obviously, Corki has some lethality variations with Emax, which are performing better than some of his other variations, but he's still underperforming within the mid lane for the average player. Once again, this is always targeted towards mid elo, low elo, as they tend to be pretty agnostic with each other. In Azir's case, he is still underperforming here. He obviously was nerfed pretty heavily because of his pro presence, and he sits within the D tier. Moving on to the C tier, we have Yasuo, who is still underperforming since the removal of lethal tempo. More people have moved over to Fleet, so he is performing a bit better on that. But overall, champion's still underperforming at the moment. He belongs in the C tier. Next to him, we have Zed. Lethality champions are underperforming. 80 assassins within the mid lane are currently underperforming. The likes of Zed is one of them. He obviously is intentionally kept a bit weak. He is a very frustrating champion to play against, so he belongs within the C tier. Katarina, also underperforming within the mid lane, was finding a bit more success on some of her AD variations over her AP variations as of recent. I believe that is still true, so try some builds, see what works for you. And yeah, Katarina's still going to be in the C tier for the moment. LeBlanc doing a bit better. Obviously got buffed for MSI. They wanted to see some LeBlanc there, and we did end up seeing some LeBlanc. It proved to be pretty good in the hands of good players. But within mid elo, does tend to underperform slightly, but she's still a solid C tier pick. Orianna, another champion which was nerfed primarily because of competitive play. She's still in a fine spot. You can operate with her in solo queue. There are some build variations you can go, obviously like the Luden's Companion, the Archangels tend to be pretty popular, but I know you can go things like Blackfire Torch. Leandri's is an option. There are build variations, pick what you need within the game, you should find some success. A solid C tier champion. Vladimir has been underperforming, kind of went from being a really solid champ at the beginning of last split to just falling all the way down. He now sits within the C tier at the moment. He is being buffed in 14.12, but yeah, still underperforming in his current state. Kassadin got over nerfed. He was performing really well. They once again took a big hit at his AP ratio. It brought him significantly down. He now sits within the C tier. Kiana, very elite skewed champion here. I would really recommend avoiding Kiana for the most part unless you are very proficient at playing the champion. You put a lot of games into the pick. If you do, you can find success on this pick. She is one of the more elite skewed champions within the game. And yeah, solid C tier pick. Moving on to the B tier with a couple of champions here. Actually, I'm going to also bring another champion down to the C tier. Talon is underperforming as well at the moment. He is obviously also being buffed in 14.12. In his current state though, he is also a big loser of AD assassin items being relatively weak, but he is going to have his W outgoing damage buffed. His Q quick stab is going to now scale with attack speed, I believe, and on top of this we are seeing a buff to Schroeder's Grudge, which will definitely help the likes of Kiana, Talon, Zed, who all want to be going this item as it has a nice amount of lethality on it. Moving on to the B tier, so Ziggs is going to lead us off here. He's in a solid spot. You have different build variations, whether this is like the burst of Luden's Rabadons, or whether you want a bit more dot, things like Blackfire Torch and Leandri can work quite nicely within this space. He just doesn't perform as well as some of the champions within the tiers above him, but he's still a very solid B tier option. Neferi, very low mid-elo skew champion, obviously for her scaling and her ability to just stat check you, but she's still underperforming. Probably deserves to be somewhere like BC. I'm actually going to drop her down to the C. She's in a pretty bad spot at the moment. Also going to get buffed in 14.12, but yeah, the champion probably needs something larger. See if they can like really push it in a direction where people are willing to play it. Rice, very solid champion. His builds are still things like your Roa, your Seraphs, and when you can operate on things like Rabadons, and you tend to go more AP heavy these days over things like tank variations. They just don't really have the same level of power. But yeah, Rice, a solid B tier pick. Hui is going to be dropped down to the B tier. Obviously, he was massively overperforming on Blackfire Torch last patch. They nerfed him down. He now sits within the B tier. Still a solid option. If you can pilot a champion well, you should find success. If you can't, I'd recommend avoiding it. It tends to be a bit harder than something like Rise, which is more reliant on like solid macro over micro, but you can still operate quite nicely on both these picks. You can find success in maybe not so much their carry potential, but their ability to manipulate how team fights are played. Yeah, something like that. Jace probably deserves to be within the B tier at the moment. Once again, he's a big loser of Grudge being relatively weak. He will benefit from what item being buffed. There are different build variations. Obviously, you have things like the Eclipse, which tends to be a bit better as like a cheap, fast power spike item. Other than that, you've got things like Youmuu's if you're looking for a bit more map control. I prefer Youmuu's. I would recommend going it over Eclipse, and then it spikes harder with Grudge, as Grudge has lethality scaling on it. So something like Youmuu's, Manamune, Edge, Grudge, and then you can kind of flex around. Obviously, Opportunity, also a solid Jace item, but he sits within the B tier for the moment. Yone is also underperforming. He's actually not underperforming as much as Yasuo. Honestly, I'm surprised they are buffing Yone over Yasuo. Yasuo has a bit harder over time with some of the items. Yone has a bit more flexibility, tends to be a bit better with Bork. Yasuo, obviously, a bit better in the bot lane role over the likes of Yone, who tends to be a bit better in both mid and top. But Yone sits within the B tier at the moment. Once again, should probably be leaning towards those fleet builds, and then maybe something like a Bork or a Phantom variation. You've got options there. It kind of depends on like what enemy comp has. Bork really good into high health stacking champions. If not, things like Phantom, i.e. Even Rush can be better within that space, but yeah, Yone in the B tier at the moment. Akali probably deserves to be slightly higher up. I think Akali is pretty strong in her current state, but people just aren't finding the level of success I would hope on this pick. Obviously, if you don't snowball on this champion, it can be quite hard to pilot within games. I think it's something people should really consider learning. Like, it's not as egregious as it was in the past, where this champion was really hard to learn and wouldn't really be that successful, as either it was pro-bound or very much elite skewed. She's being nerfed this patch. Riot have picked up on her strengths, and she's doing pretty well in normalized play. But she's a solid B tier option. If you put the games in, you could honestly jump her up to the S, and she should still find a good amount of success. Syndra is also within my B tier. She still spikes really nicely on like your Luden's Companion, your Rabadons, if you're looking for like burst variations. You tend to be playing more into that. Your mid-game spikes, obviously, they've siphoned a lot of power out of Syndra's early game, putting a lot of it within her shards and making sure you're getting those throughout the game, either through continuously trading with people or getting level thresholds. Syndra, solid B tier champion though. If you want something with solid burst and range, Syndra is a good option in that space. Malphite, this is... I mean, I would recommend defaulting more on, well, obviously when you're playing Malphite mid, you tend to be playing the AP variant, where you're going like First Strike, Malignance, Nash's, if you're going like Nash's Lich Bane, if you're going like the Split Push variation. There are options there. The other flip to this coin is into AD, like into heavy AD comps, you do have the option of going tankier, which tends to find a bit more success. AP Malphite doesn't tend to be very successful compared to some of the other picks, but there is definitely power there. He is pretty deserving of a B tier spot. He's relatively simplistic to play. Yeah, solid B tier champion. Lissandra tends to operate quite nicely on Blackfire and Ludens compared to the likes of Malignance at the moment, but Malignance tends to be her more default option. There are build variations on Lissandra which do give her a bit more power, but as she does tend to default on something like Malignance, she probably belongs in the B tier for the moment. You tend to use this champion as a bit more of a counter pick, and yeah, it can have value there. Zoe is going to wrap up the beta. Once again, Zoe's one of those champions which is actually kind of strong if you're building correctly on the pick. Lich Bane works really nicely on this champion. It gives her a lot more trading potential with the likes of her ultimate, as you tend to get Lich Bane by about 10, maybe even earlier, 10 minutes into the game. Like around that space, alongside Storks possibly. But yeah, it gives her a lot of trading power, gives Electrocute a lot of value on this pick. Does tend to fall off throughout the game though. A lot of her power comes from her early game burst, and if she can't really convert that into anything, she will just struggle later on down the line. But bit more elite skewed in solo queue, doesn't really see competitive at the moment. Not something I'd really recommend in mid elo, but there's definitely power to this pick if you build it correctly. Moving on to the A tier, so I'm adding 2 champions here. One is Nasus, and the other one is Morgana. So someone was talking about Morgana in the comment section of my last video, and I was looking into it because I was curious. Obviously, Blackfire Torch, very solid item for Morgana. It would make sense if she had a bit more power here. She's still unpopular though. I wouldn't really recommend just picking up this champion unless you're very comfortable on it. Maybe you've played Morgana in the jungle, or you've played Morgana support, or even mid in the past. She used to be quite popular here. She's a solid A tier option. Obviously, her simplicity, her easy access damage with W, just being able to pull the wave, or being able to like pull in team fights, stuff like that. Obviously, she's not as consistent as a lot of the other picks here, so I wouldn't really pick her for consistency, but for simplicity of play, how easily you can push waves, obviously you do tend to be a bit more vulnerable early on into the game. She's still a solid A tier pick. In Nasus's case, people are trolling by building Blackfire Torch on this champion every game. I'd really recommend going just your standard Trinity into like Frozen or Spirits, depending on what matchup you have. It still has a huge amount of success, and people are tanking Nasus's win rate when he's probably deserving of an S tier spot within the mid lane. Yeah, Nasus in the A tier for the moment, but could definitely be considered S tier if you are building the champion correctly. Tristana, still a very solid A tier option. Lost a bit of power with IE and Collector being nerfed. Some people did go those variations. Obviously, the more standard build at the moment seems to be your Kraken into your Flicker Blades, and then you can kind of go IE and go down that route. That still does find success, but just not as much, so she sits towards the bottom of the A tier. Viego is also within my A tier. He's a very solid mid lane option. He's actually not even on my champions here because no one really plays him at the moment, but Viego will probably get dropped at some point from my mid lane tier list if his popularity does continue to decline, but he's a solid A tier pick. Does tend to be a lot better within the mid lane than the top lane at the moment. Neeko, very unpopular champion. Honestly, about as unpopular as she was pre-rework, which is kind of unfortunate because she's still relatively strong, good within pro play. Arguably harder to play with some of the transform stuff, which can kind of like require high mechanics on the pick to really like get the full utilization out of. But her wave clear, her oppressiveness early with the likes of Airy, Scorch, Electrocute, and then yeah, stuff like that could all be pretty strong. I mean, it's pretty strong within competitive, where she does find a lot of value, but within the solo queue, it's not as appealing, so she sits at the bottom of the A tier, mainly because she just doesn't really have the power to push her up towards the S tier at the moment. Pantheon is better this patch, does tend to be a bit stronger into some of the mid lane pool than the top lane pool, but the changes were more top lane skewed. Obviously, when you're building a lot of health, this pick does get a lot more powerful now. I still would recommend sticking to things like Eclipse. That item does work quite nicely on him. But Cleaver is a really solid, considerable first item option into heavy armored comps. Maybe you're lacking a huge amount of AP and you need some shred. Pantheon isn't suddenly good into tanks, though. He still struggles within that space. They've given him like good synergy with he's got good synergy with Conqueror, Cleaver, built-in armor pen, maximum health on the W, and he still struggles into tanks. It's pretty funny at this point. But yeah, the W is a weaker spell now. The push towards maximum health over just the burst, which you got access to before, arguably just isn't as good. The E change, however, is really nice, being able to get a lot more durability out of enhanced E for 4 seconds, which is a really long time. It's really nice. It makes this pick feel quite good, and yeah, Pantheon really deserving of a solid A tier spot. Aurelia also going to be dropped down from the S tier into the A tier. She got nerfed pretty hard this patch with her health growth going down pretty heavily. I would recommend trying some Shilbo variations if you're like really feeling that lack or the missing health growth which she once had. Maybe something like a Bork, Kraken, Shilbo trio. If you're not picking up if you're not sucking health, then it can be more optimal to go Shilbo over Sterox. Other build variations are like Bork, Witch, Shilbo. And if you're going things like Bork, Cindered Sky, then Sterox does have more value in this space as you get a bit more out of the shield. But Aurelia sits towards the bottom of the A tier now, pretty close to the B tier after her nerfs. Vex is basically only used as a counterpick option. She doesn't really see much play outside of some of your heavy mobility matchups, your Yasuo, your Yone, stuff like this. Solid option though, or it seems to be performing a bit better on Blackfire Torch, but like if you're going standard, when you're going like your Ludens, your Shadow Flame for your burst, and you should still find a decent amount of success on that build. Silas tends to be a bit more counter pick reliant as well. Obviously you want good ultimates, it's where a lot of the power of this champion comes from, but he's still very heavy on burst at the moment. Q-Max, W-Max are both solid options depending on what you need. If you can get accessible first strike procs, then you should be good with Q-Max. If you want your Electrocute and you want to play like Lichbane full burst, then yeah, you can still go down the W-Max route and find decent success. Silas, a very solid A tier pick. Echo, this is still your Lichbane, it's usually Lichbane Halo Blades, with like Scorch and just playing really oppressively early on into the game. You E-dash forward, you can trade really heavily onto opponents. It can be quite hard to play against if the enemy champion can't really have any way of matching it, but not quite an S or an S plus tier pick, but a very solid A tier pick. Fizz is going to be within my A tier. He is actually probably like low A, if anything. Like Fizz and Aurelia could arguably be moved down to the B tier, and Zoe could kind of arguably be moved up to the A. Fizz obviously got nerfed pretty heavily at the beginning of last split when lots of the items were working really nice on him. He was a good abuser of Lichbane, good abuser of Storm Surge. These items have been nerfed. He got nerfed. He's still a solid pick. Obviously, really solid as like a counter pick into your Aurelian Soul. Has a lot of power in that matchup, but past that, kind of sits within the low A tier at the moment. Still has a relatively large amount of burst damage, but not as powerful as he once was. Victor is going to be my A tier. So Victor's gaining in power at the moment. He has definitely seen a pretty big popularity increase on like your first strike, your airy builds. Lichbane, I believe Blackfire Torch works quite nicely on this pick. He can work on Luden's Companion, however, if you're looking for a bit more burst. Yeah, Victor, a solid option. A bit slept on at this point. People still think this champion's pretty bad, but he's not in as bad of a spot as he was at like the beginning of last split, where a lot of the champions within the meta were really solid into him, could burst him down and make it really hard for him to play the game. Diana, also with my A tier, she is incredibly early game skewed champion. Honestly, close to the S tier. Like her power is really high early on. Her Q with like Scorch and Electrocute, it's really oppressive to play against. She can really all in on you at most periods of the game. If she falls behind, she is going to really struggle. She doesn't get a huge amount of value out of her ultimate if she is behind the curve. But if she's ahead, she can take over games, close out within like 20-25 minutes, and yeah, it can be really hard to play against. Diana, solid A tier pick. Aso, in a more balanced spot at this point, obviously got nerfed a couple of times to kind of put him here. Saw a bit of pro play, which was good to see. Aso's a pretty interesting champion. The pick still spikes really nicely on his standard items, your Rylai, your Leandri, and then like there are Lost Chapter variations you can go. He's not as bound to Archangels. Blackfire Torch, I believe, operates on this champion well, but not quite as good as Rylai. I'm actually going to quickly look this up, as I don't know what the data suggests this patch from the Blackfire to Rylai. So yeah, Rylai outperforms Blackfire at the moment as like a first item option, and then something like an Archangels, you can forego Rylai into Leandri, that tends to be your 2-item core. You can forego Archangels and pick up things like Zhonya's, Crypt Bloom, Rabadon, Void Staff if you need it, Banshee if you want something a bit more defensive. But Aso performing relatively well at the moment. Still a very solid scaling pick, a very deserving A tier champion. Ari got nerfed in 14.10. Lost a bit of power there. Obviously her safety net, it might be 14.9. Yeah, Ari got nerfed. She lost a bit of power. Her ult CD went up. Her W damage went down. Lichbane Malignance was like her 2-item core. I believe it still is. And yeah, her safety net is like her main thing. Still a solid burst. Kind of middle of the A tier at this point. Obviously, there's the whole drama with the 500-pound skin, and that will be interesting to see how that affects her ban rate in 14.12. But she's still a solid champion, a good A tier pick. Tilia doesn't really move. She lost a bit of power on her Q. She lost a slight bit of win rate, but she's still relatively strong in the mid lane. If you can get her in good matchups, she can output a large amount of DPS if ahead of the curve. Even behind the curve, she could still output a decent amount of DPS. You're looking at like your Blackfire Torch variations. She does tend to find a lot of success on this build. However, Archangels, Ludens are still things you can go if you do need them. And then you tend to go standard mage variation. yeah, if you Talia still finds a lot of success within the mid lane, still a very deserving A tier champion. Anivia, great control pick. I've actually seen a lot more Anivia recently. The pick seems to have gained a bit more popularity. Yeah, the main things obviously your Roa, your Seraphs, if you are in need of tier, which I believe Anivia still is to be. On top of this, you can just go standard mage variations. She tends to be deceptively strong early on into the game. People disrespect Anivia, and she will burst you down with the likes of Electrocute, possibly Scorch, Mana Flow. With Scorch, if you are going like Mana Flow Scorch, I know some people like going like your Presence and your cut down variations. That is something people do go. But yeah, Anivia, a very solid A tier champion. Vel'Koz, some people have played him, good, because this pick is really strong at the moment. He works really nicely on Blackfire Torch. His wave clear is definitely a lot better. He's kind of creeped up with buffs over time. Not quite deserving of an S tier spot. He's still an artillery mage, which can like struggle against certain picks, but and tends to be a bit harder to pilot than the likes of Xerath, but he's still very deserving of an A tier spot. The last two champs are Swain and Heimerdinger. So Swain, we already know, is going to be getting a mini rework at some point. He is declining in popularity in all 4 of his roles. At this point, it doesn't really feel like he's supported anywhere. Like, support is his core audience, but it's pretty bad. Mid doesn't really feel supported. Its play rate is really low at this point, but you're still really strong on a lot of your items. Your Blackfire, your Malignance possibly, if you do want like that ult CD. Rylai, Liandry, Zonya all work really nicely on this pick. Really depends on what you need within the game state, but yeah, Swain, really solid pick. Heimerdinger, gain a lot of power with the Blackfire Torch. Just like some of the mage items, this split is definitely doing pretty well at the moment. Very deserving of a high A tier spot. Relatively easy to play. Obviously, you tend to just auto-push wave with turrets, but there is definitely a skill ceiling to this champion, which can be exploited. And people don't really know how to play that much against Heimerdinger, so you can have some power in that space. Moving on to the S tier, we have a couple of champions here. So, Lux, still a great pick, very simplistic to play, really obnoxious wave clear, great burst potential, really solid itemization at the moment, very deserving of an S tier spot. Veigar, also very deserving of an S tier spot, still has great build variations. Obviously, Shirelia being nerfed did hurt him, but it's still something he can go. Dead Man's later on into his build is still a solid option, but your standard core is still things like your Roa, your Seraphs, your Luden's Companion if you want access to a bit more burst. Rabadon's still a great item on this champion. Obviously, he gets a lot of AP through his passive, so it really enhances the value of something like the Rabadons. And then something like a Crypt Bloom or Void Staff later on into his build can be quite good, but he does really value movement and defensive items. Still a great S tier champion. Malzahar gained a lot of power out of Blackfire Torch this patch, or last patch, and is still really doing quite well going into this patch. It solidifies him as a great S tier champion. He's incredibly easy to play. It's really hard to move Malzahar as he can just auto push most waves. If you can CS well, get your item spikes early on into the game, you've got a very simplistic game plan. Shut down the enemy carry. Like you operate really nicely as like an anti-carry. And yeah, you should find a lot of success on Malzahar, a great S tier champion. Twisted Fate is one of the strongest champions on the patch. He is obviously being nerfed in 14.12, but he still works really well at the moment. But he works incredibly well at the moment. Obviously for mid lane, you tend to go primarily your AP variations. This will be things like Lichbane, Lichbane, and then like different variations of like builds. In fact, Twisted Fate has a lot of accessibility in terms of what he can go. Lichbane, Rabadon, RFC, Zonya, Crypt Bloom. These are just items which like work nicely on him if you do need them. Obviously, Void Staff if you're going like a pure AP build. Not as reliant, but yeah, Roa is also another great item on Twisted Fate. Like you can think of like most AP items you can think of can work quite nicely in this pick. I saw someone going Blackfire Torch Liandry and finding a lot of success, like a lot of dot through his card throws. There's lots of build variations. He's in a great spot at the moment, a great S tier pick. Brand, very simplistic to play, great itemization in his current state. Your Blackfire Torch, your Rylai, your Liandry, gives him so much AoE teamfight control. Great S tier pick. Seraph, an amazing artillery mage. Really benefited from Luden's Companion going back to Luden's Companion going back to like Luden's Tempest kind of direction, where a lot of its power is within its like first hit burst. He's doing a lot better at the moment. A great S tier pick. Akshan, the best elite skewed mid laner in the game at the moment. He is performing really well in high elo. Obviously, going to get nerfed in 40.12. His build variations are really good. You tend to like default on Kraken Slayer as your first item at the moment, but you can go things like Collector, IE, and then like power through with more continuous crit variations. But there are options there. Akshan in a great spot at the moment, a great S tier pick. Annie, her simplicity combined with her itemization at the moment puts her in a really good spot. I believe she really values current Blackfire Torch, but she also works really well on Malignance for like uptime on Tibbers, so that would surprise me as being like a cool option. Yeah, both Malignance, Blackfire Torch really competitive. Leandri works really nicely as a second item option. Rhyolite is good on Annie if you are playing for Tibbers, so if you're going like Malignance, Leandri, Rhyolite, that can work quite nicely. On top of this, Blackfire can also work nicely as a second item option, but then if you're going something like Malignance and then you're snowballing, then you could go Storm Surge. That could also work quite nicely on this pick. Annie also has a lot of build variations. She is in a very strong spot at the moment. A great S tier pick. Galio, so the tank variation has definitely taken up as being like the primary way to play this champion. Obviously, don't forget you can still go like your Lichbane variations and still have a lot of success if you're going like a burst build. But yeah, the build tends to be Hollow Radiance, Riftmaker as like your standard core, and then you go into the more tankier builds or like AP health items, and you can find a lot of success on this pick. He is great into a lot of the magic damage within the mid lane pool at the moment. He definitely benefits from AD Assassins underperforming, Yasuo Yo not really being in the meta at the moment. Yeah. Fizz, Galio in a great spot at the moment, really good into Fizz, and yeah, lots of power here, great S tier pick. 2 champions left, so Cassiopeia, a great pick for like her itemization. Roa, Seraphs, I mean, like, you can go, like, full AP builds, or you can go, like, AP health hybrids, like Rhyolite, stuff like that can work really nicely on this champion. Her kiting gives her so much power. She's great into, like, tanky compositions with not a huge amount of lockdown, but, like, Telegraph CC where you can, like, dodge it, and, yeah, like, get a lot of value out of ground, stuff like that. Should give her a lot of power within the game. A great S tier pick. And then my S plus tier pick for the mid lane at the moment is Tryndamere. He is overpowered in his current state. He is very hard to move out of lane with both Grasp and Fleet being 2 core keystone options for him. He then goes Ravenous into Phantom Dancer. It makes him really oppressive to fight against. It makes him really hard to move. It gives him great, if he's running the likes of Grasp, he tends to run Demolish, which gives him an incredible amount of split push to potential, which can be once again really oppressive to play against, especially if you're a tank who can't really move him off the tower without possibly putting yourself in threat of being dove, or just being all in, stuff like that. But yeah, Tryndamere, really strong at the moment. They are loving him next patch. This is twice now within like the last 2 years where Tryndamere has like been really oppressive within the mid lane. Obviously last time it was like the Navori Perma-E uptime build, which ended up being really strong. Saw a bit of competitive play. Got nerfed down, but yeah, Tryndamere, once again, really strong within the mid lane. A great S plus pick. Abuse it before it is nerfed. And yeah, those are my thoughts. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next one. Goodbye.